There are rare and extraordinary people that you'll meet over the course of your lifetime in really important moments that change the entire trajectory of your life. And the thing is, you might not even know it. For example, think about this scenario, right? You're a single young person, and someone who somehow knows taps you on the shoulder and looks with you across the room and tells you, that person over there, they're going to change your life. You don't even know her name yet, but you will. And your life is going to change. You'll fall in love, get married. You'll live a whole life together, raise a family. You are about to make drastic changes in your life that you won't even believe that you're capable of. And you're going to love every second of it. And then 50 years from now, you still won't be able to imagine living your life without her in it. Right? I mean, this really happens, right? I know this because I get to visit some of our shut-ins, and they love to talk about and announce how many years they've been married, and they love talking about how they met. And it sounds a lot like this sometimes. Or I guess I also get to do premarital counseling, and I get to hear stories like one day there I was going bowling with a church group, or it was a cold winter day, and there I was on my snowmobile, and there he was. And my life will never be the same, right? Or maybe as an employer or a college advisor or a really good teacher, or, this one changes everything. Maybe you get handed a little baby, and those things change your lifestyle a little bit. The thing is, there are people who you meet in your lifetime, and you don't know it at the time, but they change everything you know about your life. But imagine, though, you're in that scenario, right? And somehow you know it. That right over there is someone who will drastically change your life. Your schedule is about to change, your priorities, your goals, your diet is about to change for better or worse, richer or poorer. The entire trajectory of your life is about to change, and you're going to love it. Happy Valentine's Day, everybody, by the way. But imagine you're at a life juncture like that, and somehow you know it. Maybe you're about to meet your spouse, maybe you're applying for a job, picking a college major, getting a medical operation. Whatever that thing is, it is going to change your life in really profound ways for the better. Now, if you're here, here's a question. What do you do next in that moment? It's not really a fair question, because if you're in one of those moments in your life, you probably don't know it. Which is a good thing, because if you knew your life was about to change like that, you would be terrified. But what would you do if you knew that you were in that situation, that the person over there that you hadn't really even met yet was going to change everything about your life? I don't really know what you do, right? It'd be hard to ignore. You couldn't be apathetic. And I don't know, maybe you try and play it cool or seem disinterested, but you'd be faking it because it's really important. You'd have to sort of just lean in, right? You'd have lots of questions. What's his name? What's he like? Tell me more about this job, college major, or this place I'm going to live for the next decade. Like, you couldn't help it but being curious. And you'd ask a ton of questions, and the more drastic the change, the more questions you'd have. In fact, you might be skeptical, like, really? I'm majoring in what now? Like, will this operation really work? I've never even heard of that field. Or this guy? What's the big deal about him? In fact, the bigger the claims for the change in your life the person will bring, I'll bet the more questions you're going to have. And the more time you're going to spend investigating on Google or whatever, and none of the things you discover will seem trivial. You will pay attention as though your life depends on it, because it might. Now, the Apostle Paul has just introduced you to a moment like that. There's someone who is going to change your life. And if you're following along in Scripture, we're in the short book of Colossians, and if you've been here for the last couple weeks, you know that the Apostle Paul has talked an awful lot about change, because he has watched faith radically transform people just like us to become people who bear fruit, who have joy, purpose, refuge, and hope even though life is hard. And we ended last week, if you're here, with this sort of incredible claim. Paul says, and this is Colossians chapter 1, we're in I'll review, we'll go to verse 11. And he's describing the sort of change that happens to people like us. He says, being strengthened with all power according to his glorious might, so that you might have great endurance and patience, giving joyful thanks to the Father who has qualified you to share in the inheritance of his holy people in the kingdom of light. And I love this. For he has rescued us from the dominion of darkness and brought us into the kingdom of the Son he loves, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. We talked about this last week, and we started to unpack this. And we said some of the sort of obvious things, that Jesus makes a difference. I mean, Paul right here makes the claim that Jesus can change people like you and me from feeling weak and helpless to, you see it, being strengthened with all power according to his glorious might, which, I mean, if you feel sort of weak and helpless now, you know how big of a change that is. The claim that Paul's making is that Jesus makes people like you and me, changes from being impatient and ready to give up to, we see it, having great endurance and patience. Like, these are massive life changes, and we didn't really talk much about the words like inheritance or kingdom of light, or, I love this one, being rescued from the dominion of darkness. And we could go back further in Colossians and talk about what Paul says about fruit, changing people from being hopeless to being hopeful, from being joyless to joyful, from selfish, from selfless. Like, these are changes that if you really thought about what it would look like in your life, you will rightfully think that this sounds impossible. Like, what sort of person or thing could so drastically change my life like this? Because if you really think about it, it's discouraging. You might think, I'm not sure if anything can really change people. Who is this guy to say he could change me? And I mean, sure, I'd much rather be joyful than worried, but I mean, it's not easy. What would it take to change me? And it's a really natural follow-up question to what Paul just claimed. And what's fascinating is that the verses we're about to look at today, you're going to discover that the Apostle Paul is answering that exact question. And he has a lot to say. And I think we all need to hear this, because if you're reluctant to get your hopes up, if you think that, I don't know if it's possible to escape bad habits or bad patterns, or I'm spiraling and I can't escape, you need to hear what Paul is about to say about this person that Paul says can change your life. In fact, I think you should sort of lean in and ask questions and hear what Paul says about Jesus. And in short, Paul says, Jesus is a big deal. Hang on, we have a lot to cover. This is Colossians 1:15. Here's what Paul says. The Son, so Jesus, is the image of the invisible God, which is sort of a weird label, right? Like, how can something invisible have an image? And it might sort of help to know that in Greek philosophy, how everybody was thinking at the time, there was a really tight connection between an image and reality. Like, they didn't have facsimiles, copies. If there was a reflection of something, something else was there to be reflected. An image in Greek philosophy wasn't a different thing. It wasn't a copy. It was sort of the same thing. Google it. You have to look it up. Long story short, as the image of God, what Paul's saying is that Jesus is an exact, visible representation of God. If it helps, let me do this. It's sort of like, imagine there's someone sitting on the other side of that hallway, right? And I can't see them because they're on the other side of the hallway. But imagine in that doorway there's a mirror, right? And I could see in that mirror the mirror image of the person in the hallway. That could work. That's essentially what Jesus is saying, right? Jesus is the mirror image of the God who's there, but we normally can't see him. And you may be aware of his presence, and most religions have this idea that there's something out there. You can't see him, you can't really, it's a God of my understanding. But Jesus does something really important. With Jesus, you look at him and you see God himself. And I should add, because you know this, human beings are also made in the image of God, according to Genesis. But for Paul, the Son is the only satisfactory likeness. So he leads with, to paraphrase a bit, Paul goes, let me tell you about Jesus. He's a big deal because he's God revealed in the flesh. And I think the really cool thing, and I think lots of you have experienced this, but the more you see Jesus, the more you start discovering what God is actually like and what God requires of us, and the fact that God is a God of incredible, generous love, which is why, by the way, Paul puts this poem right after Paul's prayer in the middle of Colossians 1, that, I pray that people would be grateful for God, because when you see what God's really like, you can't help but being thankful. But he's not done, because then he adds, the firstborn of all creation. Now, I'll be honest again, this is another sort of confusing description, because when you think about the word firstborn, the implication was that someone was born first, which is not exactly what it means. Paul isn't saying that Paul was the first thing created or the first thing born. In the Bible, this is important. When you see this title, it most often expresses status. For example, Psalm 89, verse 27 says, it is used as a title of sovereignty. The psalmist writes, I will also appoint my firstborn, the most exalted king of the earth, which is, I guess I should say, it's Hebrew parallelism. We'll talk a lot about Hebrew poetry at the 5 o'clock service coming out. If you want to learn about Hebrew poetry, it's sort of fascinating. It opens up the Bible to you. But what Paul's saying here is, look, think of anything that was ever made. Think of the earth, empires, companies, technology, nature. Think of anything that was made out of anything. You should know that Jesus is better than whatever you're thinking of. He's supreme, which might be really helpful to know, because I'll bet all those things may have already disappointed you. It may have already let you down, so you need to know Jesus is better. And you might be asking, okay, well, how is Jesus over all creation? The simple answer is what Paul says next. Well, because Jesus made everything. So here's what Paul says next. You should know this about this guy. In him, all things were created. And then he sort of just outlines everything you can imagine. Everything in heaven and on earth, all the stuff that's visible and invisible. Take a pick. Thrones, powers, rulers, authorities. Just in case you're thinking of something else, all things have been created, and he says two things, through him and for him. In other words, here's what you should know about this guy. He's actually powerful enough to make a difference in your life, because he made everything, and everything was made for Jesus, which is something incredible to say about somebody, that he made everything, but also says something about, well, everything. Do you know what the world is? Look at creation, the environment, technology. He made it all. It's his workmanship, and our world is beautiful, powerful, and sweet, because that's how God made it. That's how Jesus made it. And when, in those moments when the beauty of this world makes you catch your breath, remember that it's like that because of Jesus. And again, you may be thinking, I don't want to oversell this too much. The fact is, the created world is also full of ugliness and evil and cancer and disease and sickness and death itself. And that's true. And it wasn't the original intention. And what Paul is excited about, the good news that he's about to announce, is that the God who made the earth is the one who's acting to heal it. The earth may have wickedness and corruption and brokenness, and it may have corrupted so much, but the one who's going to fix it is the one who made it, which is the whole point of Paul using this poem, that Jesus, the one who made the world in the first place, is, I mean, think about it, the same guy, Jesus, is the one who's going to heal the world and redeem it and renew it. If you think about it, the only one who could fix this mess is the one who made it perfect in the first place. The first, and it keeps going, like the firstborn from the dead. Jesus is like labeled in this poem as the one who has conquered shame and death and all the things that threaten this broken world. You know, I think I put an N.T. Wright quote in your handout. I just thought this was so powerful. He points out that for Christians like us sitting in rooms like this, and let's be honest, we are all struggling, we all need to grow. He says, do you know what we really need? He says the thing that we need above everything else, if you're going to get out of this slump, if you're going to grow as Christians, if you want to grow in wisdom and power and patience and gratitude, you know what we really need? He says we need to know the centrality and supremacy of Jesus. Because the more you get to know and know about this guy, about Jesus, the more you start understanding who God is and what he's already done. And the more you do that, the more you learn what it means to live in and for Jesus. But the Apostle Paul's not done. He keeps going. This is verse 17. Jesus is before all things. In him all things hold together. He's the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything Jesus might have the supremacy. For God was pleased to have all of his fullness dwell in Jesus, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. I mean, Jesus is a big deal. He's the head of the body. He's over the church, so everything we do should be following Jesus. Paul says he's the first to rise from the dead, which means that we don't have to be afraid of death. Jesus is the one through whose cruel death on the cross God has dealt with our sins. And because of Jesus' death, we have peace and reconciliation, which, by the way, the death of Christ on the cross is the only thing powerful enough to give us hope and confidence that Christ can somehow accomplish good things, even in the most dark and tragic of our own stories. Jesus is the one who is beginning the new creation. I mean, this is who Jesus is. Jesus is a big deal. And when you know Jesus, you know what it's like to be truly human. If we're made in the image of God, and most of us settle for well below that, Jesus calls us to experience what it means to live out our identity as being made in the image of God. And Paul wants you to know what else Jesus did. And it starts to get really personal. Because right now, in the next couple verses, he's about to tell this testimony, this story of everyone who claims to be a Christian. What he's about to say next is about looking at your life and seeing the change in trajectory that someone can make. Here's what Paul says in verse 21. Once, every Christian, once you were alienated from God and enemies in your minds because of your evil behavior. Ouch. Like that's where we're going. If that's true, and it is, it's actually really hard to be prideful, right? It becomes a lot easier to wallow in guilt and hopelessness, low self-worth. Those are easy identity traps. In fact, I'll say if that really sinks in, it also becomes really hard to judge other people. You can't really look down at other people if you know how far you have to look up to Jesus. That's where we were. And that's not the end of the story. Paul says, and he has this 2 words he puts together all over his writings that just change everything. He says, but now. In other words, like you were an enemy with God, you were not on speaking terms with God, but now, he says, the next verse, He has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death to present you holy in His sight, without blemish, and I love this, free from accusation. In other words, and I wish I could just talk about this phrase for a while, because this profoundly changes your identity and who you look at, or how you look at yourself and other people. But what Paul says, because Jesus died for your sin, not only are you reconciled with God, but you are, you see this, God presents you, like me, as holy. I wish I could talk about that for a while longer. And then he adds, if you continue in your faith, established and firm, and do not move from the hope held out in the gospel. This is the gospel that you have heard and has been proclaimed to every creature under heaven, and of which I, Paul, have become a servant. Whew. All right, I'll be honest. This is a lot of, it's not that many verses, but it's a lot of ideas. And it would be really actually easy to stop every couple words and talk about each one at the same time. It's overwhelming. Actually, it reminds me, when I lived in Philadelphia, there was a really large mall at the edge of the city. It was called the King of Prussia Mall. And at the time, when I was in grad school, it held the claim, just in square footage, it was the largest mall in America. And we all would say ridiculous things about Minneapolis and the Mall of America and the Vikings. And I mean, that's another story. But people who liked shopping loved this mall. Because you could spend all day, I mean, forget a day, you could spend an entire week at the King of Prussia Mall without going to the same shop twice. And of course, you could spend all your money there. Dave Ramsey will probably talk about that. Lots of people do. And I don't really like shopping, but one day, one of my friends driving through the state calls me. He's Josh. He says, hey, let's meet at the mall for Chinese food, which seemed really easy. And I go, and I got lost right off the bat. I had no idea that a mall would have more than one Chinese food place. So there I am at Chinese food court 1. My friend Josh is at food court like 13 or something. And I'm just completely lost because I got to find my buddy. And fortunately, what I discovered in this giant mall, that every couple blocks or so, there was a map. Fantastic. So I run to the map, and the map is, well, it's about 10 feet tall, with the stores about this big, and it's massive, lots of details. And I had no idea what to do with something that big. And do you know how you make sense of something that big and complicated? Well, you look for this little red dot that say this really helpful words, right? You are here, right? And once I could go, this may be overwhelming, but here I am. I could figure out what my next steps were, where to go. As it turned out, I think I had to walk, so I'm here. Food court 15 is way over, it's up there. So I've got to walk 300 yards, go past 4 gaps, take a left to the 3rd Macy's. I mean, I gotta be honest, I got lost 4 more times, but fortunately there was another map. It was huge, overwhelming, but another little red dot that said, you are here, and you start over again. You know, I think what the Apostle Paul is doing right here is he understands that what he just said about Jesus in verses 15 through 20 is overwhelming. And it's overpowering. It's literally cosmic. What do? Hey, oh, you made the world. I'm Sam. Nice to meet you. What do you do there? So, and it's wonderful. It's overwhelming. We sing songs about it, but it's a lot. And if you're like me, if you're like the Colossians, you sort of go, what do I do with all this? And what Paul just did is he brings it all into focus. And what he just did in the verses on this screen is he goes, you are here. What Paul did in the verses before this, he sets out this map, creation, redemption, heaven, hell. This is Jesus. And Paul goes, here's where you are, right there on the map. And the first thing Paul says, look, you should know, it wasn't that long ago. You were nowhere on this map. God had a purpose for the world, and you were like headed in the wrong direction. You were an enemy of God. But now the Colossians have good news announced. And you do too. You belong to God. And I love the phrase, we talked about this, but now. It's one of Paul's favorite phrases, and it says it all. Once you were outside, you were sinful, you were apart from God, but now God did something, and your entire life changes. And Paul doesn't quite take the time to go through the details in this passage, exactly how Christ's death on the cross accomplishes this, but he does declare that we have been, another big word for Paul, reconciled. Notice all the hostility, all the enmity, all the tension that was keeping people like us apart from God, the hostility, the sin that did its worst to Jesus on the cross is conquered. And what Paul's announced that now, in the death of Christ, God and people like us are brought together. And now, shockingly almost, you and I can approach the living, holy God without a hint of accusation. We go to God as holy people because Jesus bore the punishment. That is the heart of the good news that changes the trajectory of our lives. And he's not shy about saying that the effects of the gospel don't happen automatically. You don't just sit around and not do anything. He points it out again to, as a Christian, keep firmly on, to be established, to grow in faith, to take action, that following Jesus is more than just hearing about Jesus and believing. It's action that keeps going day to day. That you are here on the map and you've got some steps to take. And the steps start really simply by seeing who Jesus is. Jesus is actually a really big deal. Probably a bigger deal than you might think. I'll be honest, I don't usually talk about this much. I had really mixed feelings about my sermon titles. I don't love doing sermon titles, but I want to have something in the bulletin and making a big deal about Jesus. And on top of that, like the spacing's a little weird. It almost looks like it says making about big deal Jesus, which I'm not really sure what that sermon would be about. But there it is. What I don't like about it, it's too late to change now, but when you use the phrase making a big deal about something, implies that something isn't a big deal and you make it into a big deal, right? In fact, the most common way the phrase is used is fill in the blank, making a big deal out of nothing, right? Which is kind of the wrong idea. It's confusing, kind of like that Old Testament phrase, magnify. It's all over the Psalms, right? Magnify the Lord with me. And I remember hearing John Piper talk about this once. And he says, you read the Bible, you think words like, or you see something like magnify the Lord, and you all think magnifying glass. Like, you know how those things work, right? It's a tool. You take something very small and you make it bigger. And Piper says that's not the right idea. It's more like, if you want to pick a lens, it's more like a telescope that you're looking up at the universe with. And you kind of go, all right, it's God is huge. And this scope can help me try and see how big it is. In other words, here's what we do. It's not like God is a little deal and we look at him closely. It's like God is massive and we just need to start seeing him. And I think that's what Paul is doing in this passage of Scripture. And I think maybe he wants something really specific for you today, especially if you feel in the heart of your soul, if you're feeling, to paraphrase the hymn, weary. Or if you look around and it's hard to see anything but darkness. I think maybe, in short, what God is telling you to do right now is, in short, look at Jesus. Turn your eyes on Jesus. What does that even mean? Like, what do we do with Jesus? What would it look like for you today to make a big deal, to turn your eyes on someone who could radically change our lives, our community, our culture? What is Paul trying to accomplish here? I think, simply put, to repeat verse, I think it's 18, so that in everything, Paul says, Jesus might have the supremacy. In other words, the next step for each of us is letting Jesus be priority number one in your life, in your family. Jesus should have first place in your marriages, your careers, our time, and our love and our conversation, first place in our entertainment, first place in our worship. Goshen Church, really simply, I think God is calling us to make a big deal about Jesus, to turn our eyes on Jesus. I think God is calling us to give Jesus first place, whatever that looks like, then to watch and see what he does next. Father in heaven, I pray that you would help us, those of us who are weary and tired, who look around and see few causes for hope. Can you help us in the midst of this to turn our eyes upon Jesus? Can you reveal yourself? Help us to look for you. May we see you. Can you show us all the little ways in which we need to give you more control? And can you give us the hope, the change, the love that comes